This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Santa Cruz, and Salinas. The views expressed here are those of myself, Mae Brussell, and do not necessarily reflect the views of KAZU staff or board of directors. We want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronics components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps to bring you the following hour of World Watchers. The following hour of World Watchers is made possible also in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 831, November the 9th, 1987. I'm going to spend the next 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, as much as I think is necessary to make inroads, into a multiple group of problems and questions that I've had on the air for many, many years, going back to the early 70s, but which are all coming to a head at this time, interestingly enough. And people who have taken a back broadcast might have wondered what the connections were between a lot of material that I had on Son of Sam, the Manson family, the occult, Hitler's occult, the law enforcement, and so forth, and the Defense Department. And now the combination of forces of these very elements are coming together very loud and clear. I was up in San Francisco yesterday with Barbara Honegger. We saw that play I recommended to listeners. It's called A Bright Room Called Day. It's a very good play. It's written by a man named Mr. Kushner. He's from New York, Tony Kushner. And it has a setting of the Weimar Republic in 1932 and 33, where a group of intellectuals are gathering for a New Year's Eve party. And the rest of the play is about how each individual has to deal with his society falling apart, their dreams smashed, and the reality of Germany is all of a sudden something totally different than any of them had ever imagined, in spite of there being such great intellectuals. The parallels here are tremendous. It reminds me of people from the Democratic Party or the civil rights people concerned with human rights or various affairs, the Iran-Contra affair, and the secret team, who are in some ways just talking about situations at the very easy level, assuming that if we do this, then the response will be thus and so. And I'm absolutely convinced that there are forces that have planned much more for us and that people are not addressing those problems. When candidates come through, Democratic candidates, even Republicans, if you want to ask them, the question isn't personality, whether it's Mr. Dukakis or Senator Gore or Babbitt or so forth. It isn't the individuals. It is the problems we are facing, and they should be asked about the problems, whoever they are. And it doesn't matter who you decide to have a candidate there selected for you. It is the problems that have to come out. Now, the greater part of the day, from 1 o'clock until 6, we were at the Mark Hopkins Hotel for a conference of psychologists and persons who have been sexually molested, who have been victim of satanic rites, whose cases now, some of them are in a matter up in San Francisco Bay Area that link to international problems, actually. And this conference was set up by Felix Polk, the parent, he and his wife, parents of sexually abused child, and several other psychologists and 2 people from the McMartin School from Los Angeles, talking about the satanic rites that the children go through in the nursery school, such as seeing other children cut up and the penis cut off and put in the mother's mouth, and the baby's child is wrapped up and smashed, the bones are smashed, and then it's burned in front of these children. And there are there are cassette tapes of this conference that we attended. It was all day. The tapes, 3 tapes for the entire conference are $20. You can write to Conference Recording Service, 1308 Gilman Street, Berkeley, California, 94702. You can break it up into 3 different sections of the conference, $7 each, but it's terribly important to hear the whole thing if these subjects interest you. And maybe in the next few weeks and after this evening, as I get into the material, the subject will very much begin to interest you. Two of the people attending this conference were parents of sexually abused children that were involved in Satanic rites, and I'll tell you who was taking these children from the daycare center at the Presidio in San Francisco. And one of the parents, a father, is a nuclear physicist for the Army. They had the child at the Presidio Daycare Center, and the other is a dentist, Captain Mike Tobin, a graduate of West Point. And of course, there were satanic rites and abuse of children at the nursery schools in West Point this past year at the very military academy, and that was hushed up as much as it could be. Now the case is moving identical circumstances to San Francisco and the Presidio, and maybe there will be more attention there because San Francisco is more sophisticated in getting action, political activists on these matters. The organization that these people have formed is called Enough. It's to alert people to the horror of violence against children, the failure of the criminal justice system to protect the children, and what interested me, there were young adults and teenagers that were sexually abused, but these are small children who in nursery school and very young, 4 to 6 to 8 years old, and the organization feels that there is a mass movement entirely across the United States and in Germany and so forth of people abusing children. And the common denominator of all the people who had been abused or whose children had been abused was that the law enforcement does nothing. The local police, the district attorney, the prosecution, there's nothing set up in courts for children's rights. And of course, I went into the collusion of the Justice Department, the police department with Son of Sam, and the Manson family, and the cases that I have studied because the law enforcement did nothing. But now there are parents who are establishment, can't be more establishment than military, nuclear physicist, and a dentist doing surgical work for the Army up in San Francisco. And I'm going to tell you in the weeks to come about some of that conference. They had a reading list. If you want to write to the organization for literature or help them, it's called Enough. The parents decided, and the psychologist and his wife, who decided to get this together and realized that their child had been sexually abused and that they were trusting the people at the nursery school who were in charge of him, they formed this organization called Enough, P.O. Box 712-5550, Shattuck Avenue, Berkeley, California, 94704. And if you write to them and get a reading list and become educated on this, and even on our Monterey Peninsula, I was shocked that the San Francisco Chronicle that's delivered to my home didn't have the articles all last week that were in the San Francisco Chronicle on the newsstands. The first edition that comes out was kept from the people who got it delivered at home. Now, they spoke about ritual abuse indicators and fear of children when they afraid their house will be burned or their parents will be killed, and fear of blood, and they talk about drinking blood, and they've been eating feces and drinking urine, and fear of bathtubs or having their hair washed, and afraid of needles because they're getting injections right at the Presidio Army School and then taken off the Army base to the head of a satanic organization, a man I'm going into who works for the Defense Department and takes NATO, top NATO people or members of his group through rituals of the Waffen-SS. They warned about children writing numbers backwards, letters backward, seeing satanic symbols that are being put upon them, inverted crosses, the number 666 if they're writing it. They warned about preoccupation of death. These are little tiny children. Then the parents are finding these symptoms and warning about, talking about animals being hurt or killed and descriptions of dismemberment of animals, which they are witnessing, and they going through the trauma of physical and sexual abuse. Sexually transmitted diseases is a possibility, and they witness sadistic behavior, harming animals, harming other children, and some of these children, there is a fear that magic has been implanted into them, and they are fearful of bombs, monsters, ice, insects into them themselves. The children are afraid of those things. Now, this is very serious. I think you agree, and I've saved articles across the country on this matter, but there is an organization now called Enough, and as the literature comes out, I'll be sharing it with you. Now, to get into that subject, I just want to mention that a attorney in New York City, Mario Marola, just died October the 31st, several weeks ago or 10 days ago. He was the attorney behind the Son of Sam investigation of David Berkowitz, who tried to say that David Berkowitz was the lone killer of these various people in New York, when it turns out he's part of this satanic cult that goes from coast to coast. And I'll be doing a lot to update the David Berkowitz story with you and describe parts of the book, The Ultimate Evil. Now, the attorney who prosecuted that also got Raymond Donovan off this. Mr. Marola, witness to the Raymond Donovan trial, which was being investigated again very quietly. And, of course, there were 3 murders, primary witnesses during the time our Secretary of Labor was being investigated for mafia connections. So the attorney who knows about Son of Sam and Raymond Donovan was running for an elective office. He was up as a Democrat for re-election this past week as a senior member of the New York City's 5 district attorneys. And he dropped dead of an apparent stroke. That's one of those diseases that goes around, apparent heart attack, apparent stroke. A witness to Donovan and Son of Sam, and those things aren't separately related, who won the election. His name was on the ballot. He won it, but he was good and dead, age 65. Now, in studying the coups that have taken place in this country by the Defense Department and the intelligence community, I always dated the overthrow of Iran as the first, what they called, successful coup of the establishment, business establishment. And Bill Moyers had on his program last week, I'm sure all of you saw that. It played several times, but some in the East don't get the National Public Radio and the story of the secret team that runs Washington and foreign affairs. He referred to Iran as the first coup. I have to go backwards now and say that the first coup of the United States took place actually in, I refer to that time period, where in Bern, Switzerland, where Allen Dulles was working with SS Karl Wolff and Heinrich Himmler to take over the world after the war was over, working with the Nazis. And I think America's coup didn't happen in Dallas in 1963. It happened in Bern, Switzerland. Looking up in the research on Heinrich Himmler, because of the connections to these events I'm going to share with you, in the book, The Zodiac and the Swastika, How Astrology Guided Hitler's Germany, it's written by Wilhelm Wolff, who was the astrologer, one of them for Hitler. He tells the story of how working for Heinrich Himmler, he was close to him, that they planned the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler, at which time Heinrich Himmler would be head of the Third Reich. Probably he would have been the one who escaped and left if he were the head of the country at the time. And this book says, after the unsuccessful attempt on Hitler's life, as of July 20th, 1944, I was told by Dr. Goeberts, who was in close contact with Gero von Governitz, an official on the staff of Allen Dulles' OSS services in Bern, Switzerland, that the Polish intelligence knew about Stauffenberg's plot to kill Hitler on July 10th, and they were asked to report on the reaction. What would the Poles do? What would the Ukrainians do? What would the movement do if there was a coup d'etat in Germany? So the staff of Allen Dulles in Bern, Switzerland, and with Heinrich Himmler were working with the very people, Mr. Schellenberg and so forth, who were going to try but didn't succeed in killing Hitler, at which time Heinrich Himmler would have been the head of the government. All of the while, he was head of the Gestapo, the Waffen-SS. In the same book, it describes the late Baroque castle, which Heinrich Himmler used as a retreat. And this castle is part of the San Francisco Nazi Presidio occult story I'm going into. It says this castle, which is fabulously beautiful, in a fabulously beautiful part, once belonged to Prince Schwarzenberg. It lies at the foot of the Gaisberg. It has magnificent view of Salzburg Alps. Access is difficult, but Heinrich Himmler, a ruler right alongside of Adolf Hitler, a man of steel in original activities. When he started, he was a poultry dealer, a manure salesman, interestingly. The world first took note of him June 30th, 1934, in connection with the Rome affair, in which he had been obliged to order the execution of a group of people he called conspirators. He has since then been known in the anti-Nazi circles as the Bloodhound, and Himmler comes into this story. Also, I refer many times to two books that were the key surrender of the United States to the Waffen-SS. One, Operation Sunrise, The Secret Surrender, written by Bradley Smith, that came out in 1977, and one by Alan Dulles of the OSS, who was working with Himmler's agents, called The Secret Surrender. Also, the books, their title is very close. One, Operation Sunrise - Secret Surrender. The other, The Secret Surrender, written by the man who was making the arrangements himself, Harper and Row, published it in 1966. Now, the articles that I'm going to be covering for the next few weeks in detail, I want to give you the list of them as they have come out and the reference I'm going to use, because I will be using these articles and weaving them in and out with these books for the next 3, 4, 5 weeks. I call this part one of this story, and I think you'll see why. The bibliography for the next few weeks will be one, Hitler, the Occult Messiah by Gerald Suster, published by St. Martin's in 1981. Gods and Beasts, The Nazis and the Occult by Dusty Sklar, published in 1977. The Zodiac and the Swastika, How Astrology Guided Hitler's Germany, published by Coward McCann in 1973. Secrets of the SS, Glenn Infield wrote that. Stein and Day published it in 1982. The Ultimate Evil, an investigation into America's most dangerous satanic cults. The Son of Sam, The Manson Family, published by Dolphin. It just came out 1987. And, of course, these subjects and these books I have used throughout the years as very much a part of the giving away or taking of America, whatever you want to call it. But I'm going to refer to these books before I do others as references. Now, the major articles that came out this past week, and I'm going to list them because people who get tapes of these broadcasts with other parts of the country are not getting these stories at all. It is identical to the Western Gold story and the links to the Los Angeles Police Department and the computers with the list of persons' names that were ordered destroyed. The material was ordered destroyed years ago, and it was put into Western Golds that is now in the control of Carl Spitz Channel and Admiral Thomas Moore and John Singlaub. The stories of Western Golds were in the L.A. Herald and in the L.A. Times and never made the wire services, and I have about 100 important news stories. So this is what is going to happen to you people on the east or up north in Oregon or south in Texas or wherever you are in Minneapolis and so forth. You're not going to get these unless you ask a library to send them to you. And I'm going to read the major articles that were one full page of the newspaper practically just in the past few days. The first was Satanic Cult Leader Linked to the Presidio Daycare Center. Presidio is the Army base up in San Francisco. This was San Francisco Examiner, October the 30th, written by B. Cito. And I'm putting the name of the author because many authors are in on this case. And as I say, San Francisco has a dose of this with the Manson family, the Zodiac Killer, the Zebra Killer, all linked to the same network of the occult, of the military, of the Defense Department. So maybe they'll get on this story. The next article is Molesting Rituals Reported, Presidio Child Abuse Case, San Francisco Chronicle, October 31st, Edward Lehman and Bill Wallace. The next is Army Says Constitution Lets Satanists Hold Top Secret Job, San Francisco Chronicle, November the 3rd, 1987, John Whittinger and Bill Wallace. Top secret job, you bet. He takes the NATO chiefs over to the castle of Heinrich Himmler. Wait till we get into that some more. The next major article was Presidio Satanist, A Scary Enigma to Observers. San Francisco Examiner, November the 2nd, 1987, Ivan Sharp. The next, Presidio Case Center, the first to face Army scrutiny. And maybe that's because those parents have had enough. San Jose Mercury, November the 4th, by Linda Goldston. The next, Satanism, linked to scores of U.S. child abuse cases. San Francisco Chronicle, November the 5th, Edward Lepnin. Next, Worldwide Probe of Army Centers. The Pentagon tackles the Presidio molest case. November the 5th, 1987, San Francisco Chronicle by Dave Garrell. The next, Bay Navy officer beaten to death, bludgeoned in the kitchen on his head. That was just this week, November the 5th, 1987. And because one of these men whose child was abused, who is suing, is a member of the nuclear science over in the Bay Area, and this Bay officer was bludgeoned to death, and there are people over there protesting the feasibility of Star Wars also. The next, Army team probes child abuse charges, LA Times, and they gave this story, page 35, a small 12-inch report. Now, it was that way in reverse with Western Ghouls. When LA carried that paper, the San Francisco paper didn't carry it. Of course, nothing in the Washington Post, and this is military, national, international, and I will be sending copies of these tapes and writing up charts and outlines for the Armed Services Committee. The next story, Army team probes child abuse charges. Oh, that's the LA Times. The next, separate from the Bay Area, but very important, is the elite British regiments criticized for violence in the ranks. And this is that type of activity particularly taking place when they're initiated, taken over to Germany. New York Times, November the 4th. And then Satanist accused of molesting girl. Soldier calls probe a witch hunt. That's a play on words. The Satanist is calling his investigation a witch hunt. San Jose Mercury, November the 11th, 1987, by Linda Goldstein. Now, those are the books and those are the articles that I'm going to be sharing with you regarding this matter. Now, the persons involved in this story, the cast of characters, the main two people are Michael Aquino and his wife Lilith, who came from a Satanic church in New York City, and they have a home in San Francisco when he was stationed there. And I'm going into these articles because they're long and they're detailed, but I want to tell you where I'm leading to so you have some idea of what this story is. He's in the Army Reserve. He's a lieutenant colonel like Oliver North. He's currently assigned as staff officers for the U.S. Army Reserve Personnel Center in St. Louis, Missouri. This little 3.5-year-old girl was one of a group of children. There's about 10 out of 55 abused children, and a gentleman on the Presidio named Gary Hambright is answering charges to only 10 of the children. That's the first collusion of the prosecution to not bring in 50 if out of 100 children, 50 were abused, sexually abused, and participated in satanic rites. The prosecution on the Presidio, which is the military part of it, has decided to limit the case to Gary Hambright. But this little girl was at the shopping center at the Presidio, and she recognized two people. And she told her parents, she's just 3.5 then, she's 4 now, that was Mickey, and the man was Mickey, and the woman was Shambi. And she grabbed her father by the legs and was very scared and suggested that they did terrible things to her and took her off the base. Mickey and Shambi were Michael and Lilith Aquino. She said she recognized them, and she gave them details of where they took her and put her in a bathtub with animal figurations on the corner of the tub and an all-black room, and that she had been injected and taken off the Army base at the Presidio to Leavenworth Drive in San Francisco. And she described all 4 walls are black, and the men were dressed as women. Those were their capes, the satanic witchcraft capes, and the woman was dressed as a man. So a search warrant was given to go into the apartment, and there were the black walls, all black walls, and there was a cross over the ceiling, which she described, and the bathtub that she said she was put in, and the clothing of these people, the Michael and Lilith Aquino. And the matter stands right now that because she was taken from a military base to a home in San Francisco, that the San Francisco police have to prosecute. But the man she was taken to is very high up in the United States military, and she was taken from a military base, and the San Francisco police are not yet charging him or her with anything, even though the child gave a 100% accurate description of what the place looked like, the ceiling, the walls, the tub, the clothing were there. The police picked up videotapes and records, all kinds of material from their computer, and have decided to stay away. The prosecutor of the Presidio sexual molestation against Gary Hambret has said, and I'll put his name and their names on the air in the weeks to come so you get to know them, at least to remember them if you want to play this back, and maybe they'll get great appointments by Ronald Reagan's successor someday. But anyway, the people involved that she described are not yet wanted by the San Francisco police. This is identical to Son of Sam Manson family and all the other horror stories that I have studied through the years. Michael Aquino, the person that she recognized as Mickey, was a former stockbroker for Merrill Lynch. There was a massacre of 8 people in Philadelphia recently where this man came out of a bunker-type home, and he was a former stockbroker for Merrill Lynch. Now, Merrill Lynch was named in Judge Kaufman's crime report as depositing money from organized crime that came from Italy, from the P2, the Pizza Connections. Donald Reagan was chairman of Merrill Lynch. He became Secretary of the Treasury under Reagan and Chief of Staff of the White House. Michael Aquino, for a while, worked at Merrill Lynch. He was a former student just recently at the National Defense University at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. He holds 2 advanced degrees in political and science. He's interested in political science from the University of California, a doctor's degree, and 1 from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And he also taught a professor of political science at Golden Gate University in San Francisco. He holds the top secret security clearance for the United States. He's highly decorated as a lieutenant colonel, served in the Green Berets in Vietnam, still holds his top security clearance, even though this situation is taking place out in San Francisco. His expertise in Vietnam War was psychological warfare, expert in PSYOPs, those are the capital letters PSYOPS, psychological operations. That was his expertise, political science and psychological operations. And for the weeks to come, I'm going to read you sections of his book, and I'm going to try and get his books, but his description of the necessity to mass produce and brainwash all people inside the United States. Never mind enemy overseas. There's nothing about enemy. It's about us. He served as a liaison officer to the NATO countries, and NATO was very much part of Licio Gelli's P2. Gelli was involved with the Bologna bombing, with Francesco Pazienza, with mass murders, with setting up the death squads in Argentina, in Bolivia, worked with the CIA. Gelli was at Reagan's inauguration. Alexander Haig was part of NATO and worked closely with Ledeen and visited Ledeen and Pazienza just 3 weeks before Reagan was inaugurated. This person was a liaison officer to the NATO countries. He is a consulting faculty member of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. And just hold this up and visualize this man getting children whose parents are working, who leave them at a military day school, and they're injected and taken to this man's apartment where the rituals begin. He believes and writes about the coming apocalypse, that there will be an annihilation. Practically most everyone will die, except for a very few elect. And he's advising the NATO, and he works with psychological operations, top secret security clearances, and is ready with the military, and he's in the military with the reserves right now, believes that this great Armageddon is going to come, and that there will be annihilation of a lot of people. He's the leader of the Temple of the Set, the Satanic Church, headquartered in San Francisco. He worked with Anton LaVey until 1975. LaVey makes the connections, and when he was working with him through those years, to Roman Polanski, to the Sharon Tate murder, to the Manson family, to David Berkowitz, to a murder at Stanford campus of the Peroff girl, the year before to the Perloff girl, and I'll go into their murders. I had those matters on the air in 1977-78 on my programs on World Watchers, and Anton LaVey was the advisor for Roman Polanski's movie when he made the Rosemary's Baby. And then the same people worked with Manson, who killed Sharon Tate and she was pregnant with a baby, and 5 other people, and then the next night killed the LaBiancas and made a grand score of 8 people while they wrote Helter Skelter to make it look like the Beatles were associated with the violence. And if that wasn't enough, they left the credit cards of Bianca's and others in the black part of town to make it look like black people did these murders. I've done years of broadcasting, but I'm going to update it now for new listeners and people who weren't listening to World Watchers back in those days, and show how those materials are coming together now. We'll take a 1-minute break because this is the end of the half hour. And then when this is over, I want to remind you that at the end of this half hour to call 375-3082. And it is your turn to talk about matters that are in the news. I didn't want to get into Judge Ginsburg, very important things that I brought in, but I don't want to divert from this subject. You'll just have to read your papers, and in the second half hour we can talk about those matters. But I think you will agree that enough is enough, and it was important enough for Barbara Honegger and I to go up there and be riveted just listening to what happened yesterday. And as I say, I'll get those tapes and share them with you. And people in the audience in front of us, behind us, were crying. The analysts were talking, and the memories of how these people were abused and mutilated and so forth, and the discussion of these children. And the very scary part, and I have to tell you, I read in the newspaper, I'll finish the list of some of the subjects that this Aquino was involved in, and then tell you about Dr. Polk, who headed the conference, and how he completely shocked me with his indifference on a particular matter. But just to get down the list now, in the second half of World Watchers, program number 831, Mr. Aquino has conducted occult rituals patterned on ceremonies conducted by Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler, the man who was to succeed Hitler and whose arrangement for his Waffen-SS were put into the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. I said the purpose was to have the Waffen-SS meet the American army where they were secure after the war. He conducts rituals, or they talk about one, we don't know how many, on ceremonies similar to the Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler. In Himmler's Germany, he goes to the castle, once used by the Nazi SS for black magic ceremonies during the Third Reich, and Aquino performed the rituals, he said, to recreate an order of knighthood for the followers of Satan. That's what this is about as we get into this great Armageddon, the knighthood for the followers of Satan. It's not communism or anti-communism. It's that Satan is going to win, and we are part of this operation. Aquino encouraged his followers to study the beliefs of the Nazi terrorist group, and that's where Licio Gelli and Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig and the Super Seesme, the Italian intelligence group, were linked directly to the United States intelligence in these same kind of terrorist activities. He told his followers to study the beliefs of Nazi terrorist groups, particularly the early formation of the VEM, V-E-H-M, and the Thule Society, the Kuli Gesellschaft, and the I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the Ahnenerbe, A-H-N-E-N-E-R-B-E, that were two fanatical right-wing groups described in the newspapers that I listed for you. They are Aryan groups that existed before and during Hitler's reign. They started before, and they were linked to the Thule Society and the knighthood that is very much alive in Washington and in San Francisco with little kiddies and all around the country at military bases. Now, Aquino book list that he has for reading for his Church of Set, he's the high priest, includes Mein Kampf, Hitler, the Occult Messiah, the Occult Roots of Nazism. Children from the Presidio Daycare Center, as I say, were taken. This one little girl is the only one. If the prosecutor has asked the others, I don't know. There's 10 people that the Daycare Center caretaker, Gary Hambert, is charged with sexually molesting. I don't know how many went to the home. It could have been the 50 that were molested, but they're talking about one. You know, with the Kennedy assassination, there was one man. It was Oswald. With World War II, it was one man, Adolf Hitler. There's always one person. With Watergate, there was one man, Richard Nixon. these very complex plots are reduced to one. Now, as I say, the San Francisco police raided the apartment of Aquino and his wife and found exactly what the children were describing. And he is still in St. Louis. He has his top security clearance. He worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, which was the agency set up by Daniel Graham, was the chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he worked there in 1981. And I have to look up, forgot to do it when I came in today, the years that Daniel Graham was head of the DIA, because Daniel Graham shares offices with the Fritz Kramer. Hitler's general was in the Waffen SS. Otto von Bolschwing was up in Palo Alto with 8 years behind him and a secretary translator working for Ronald Reagan of the Waffen SS, and he was put in the OSS. And Fritz Kramer was Hitler's Fritz Kramer, prisoner number 33. And there's a lot of witchcraft, and number 666 comes through. They're asking the children if they've seen these numbers. That Fritz Kramer from the Waffen SS has taken a disappearance since World War II. And I believe it's entirely possible and almost impossible that it wasn't the man who shares offices with Daniel Graham. I've said these things are important for many, many years, and I think it's very hard for the listener to comprehend the breadth. Is not your fault. It's a hard subject, but the breadth is so wide. And it was very good timing, synchronicity, to see this play about the Weimar Republic and how incapable individual writers, producers, actors, otherwise successful people couldn't deal with Germany in 1932-33. It took Hitler to decide what to do with them, because their concerns were such as a knife scratching the table or the psychiatrist leaving Berlin without telling his patient she left, and she's hysterical. In the day-to-day things in that play were the important things, not what was really happening. The theme of that play, incidentally, it's called A Room Called Day, and it's about a very cheerful apartment that this woman loves in 1932. She's very happy with the apartment. But the warning of the person who's sort of a moderator, a young person who's speaking in front to the audience from time to time, A Bright Room Called Day it is, she warns it that when it's dark and you have nightmares, face your nightmares, face your worst fears, because that is the reality that is around you. When the rats come out at night and everything is quiet and dark, and you think about the horrors in your subconscious and in your conscious, and you relegate them. I had a bad dream last night. The playwright is saying, write down your dream and deal with it. It is real. Your dream is your reality. And your day world, that bright day where it's so cheerful and pretty, this woman just loves her apartment. It's so bright and clear that it's a beautiful apartment, and she's so lucky to have it. But it's at nighttime that all the things start happening, and people appear so distressed, and the devil enters into there, and the Reichstag fire takes place, and the author is saying, don't be cheerful all day and sleep at night, because if you don't face your fears, as I say, your fears are your reality. Now, to get into the specifics of these articles, as I say, this man worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Daniel Graham, as former director, of course, has to be very close to the DIA, and also Peregrine and General Singlaub and Robert Brown are close to the organization that was tied into Mr. Meadows and the officers of the DIA. And I'll do some more details on Mr. Michael Aquino and what's going on around this country at the daycare centers and how high up in the military it goes, where members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff belong to the Church of Set. They partake of the satanic rituals that he is a part of. He keeps in his apartment a dagger that came from Himmler's Waffen SS and shows it to people, and worships the Nazis, keeps the top security clearance. Now the argument, no argument, but in the newspapers they say there are members of Satan cults or witchcraft that can be in the military. It doesn't interfere with their military functions. But when they take a child off of a base and take her to their home and take off her clothes and she's naked and inject her with something on the way or as soon as she leaves one place, and maybe she can't remember everything that was done. They took videos and films and so forth. Once she takes a child from a care center where the mother and father have left her off, that is the crime. And by that, he should be out of the Army as quick as possible. He can do all of his hunky-dunky, but when it links to the crimes or the Manson crimes and whatever they are involved in, when it is criminal, and I think that Heinrich Himmler and the Waffen-SS is criminal because he intends that a large number will die and only a select few will live, and that's what his literature is about. So he's planning mass murder, and I've been told by people, well, in the civil liberties protected the Nazis, you have to have freedom of speech. Well, if you have freedom of speech, why can't you go in a theater and sometimes just yell fire and see how funny people drop their popcorn or spill their drink? And I can't go to the airport and yell, there's a hijacker. They would give me a fine, arrest me, and I can't stand in front of your house and say, I want to kill you. You cannot do that. You can't stand in front of a black person's house and say you're going to be killed and dead, or a Jew or anybody else, and say we plan to kill you. There are people that went to prison for planning to kill people, like Edwin Wilson was going to kill his prosecutor, and he got the charge and they socked it to him for extra years in jail. And Sandra Good of the Manson family went to jail because she was planning to kill people and sending death threats. And she's actually, the letter I got from her was the only death threat I ever got in 16 years on the radio, came from Sandra Good. But if the philosophy that you belong to is a philosophy whereby you have to die, then the freedom of speech is over, because the intent is to organize enough people to kill the people they don't want around. And I'll never win points with persons who have another view of that, but the Waffen-SS is the death head. It's called the death head. That's what it is. And this knighthood is to kill and to train to kill. And this man has now, as if it wasn't reason to bring him in before, has now taken at least one child to his place, because you can't take away her absolute description when they got a search warrant to go in there, if it was a house with powder blue walls or yellow walls and no cross on the ceiling and no capes and so forth. But she said exactly what it was, and she recognized them at the supermarket, and she was scared. And she said, Mommy, that's Mickey. And Mickey was Michael Aquino, advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Shamby was his wife, Lilith, and she knew them immediately, and the home was exactly as she described. Now, going back to early World Watchers and programs I did, and I mean, this is early. I was on the air in 1971, starting May of 1971, and I didn't start making tapes available to the broadcast until 1977, March 77. But starting in June 1977, just to read some of the subjects I had on the air that pertain to these cases, one in June 6, 77, program number 272 is Hypnosis, Mind Erasing of the CIA, Victims of the CIA. Another broadcast the following week about Dr. Edward Simpson Callis, who passed away this year, and his exposés of mind control and how the prison system doesn't let a selected patsy be deprogrammed, such as Sirhan. So the killers go free, but a selected patsy has to stay in that mental state. I was talking about the neutron bomb in 1977, and then starting August the 15th, Part 1, Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, the CIA zombie test, and the mind control of David Berkowitz. Now, The Ultimate Evil just came out, but I was working on these things out here and shared them on the air, broadcast 282. 283 was Son of Sam, the capture of Son of Sam, the police connections to him, and the CIA connections to the New York Police Department. Again, in October 77, the CIA mind control, the purpose, the goals, how it applies to political assassinations, and some more of Son of Sam in 1977. And then I was talking about the links of John Wheat Carr, the real son of Sam, who was murdered on a U.S. Army base in South Dakota, that he was a son of Sam Carr, and that this was a military condition. He was murdered, and again, it tied into the ritualistic murders. Oh, getting back to Dr. Polk, 1 minute, because this son of Sam and John Wheat Carr comes to mind. He was the gentleman who planned the meeting yesterday and is head of the organization called Enough. And after seeing in the newspaper all these things about Heinrich Himmler and the sexual assaults upon these young people, I called him in Berkeley. His name was in the San Francisco Chronicle telling about this conference. And I said I'd like to attend, and as I say, Barbara Honegger went up with me, and we really wanted to hear what this situation was. And Dr. Polk was the first speaker to talk about his son, and his wife talked about their son's abuse, just this little fellow, and the things that he's been able to say happened to him. And he's very tiny, but he's able to say that much. Dr. Polk began by saying that he was 9 years old when the war was over, that he lived in a concentration camp, that his mother and father lived in a concentration camp and had come to this country where he's a psychologist at Berkeley, in Berkeley, California, not associated with the university, but in private practice. And then he proceeded to monitor or be the host to all the various speakers and didn't once mention the newspaper articles relating to Heinrich Himmler, the Joint Chief of Staff. I thought it would be a political awareness of fascism with a capital F, fascism. But the very people that came from Germany weren't able to see the parallels, didn't want to talk about it, and I took a bare minimum of material to them, thinking that if they have an interest, they can call me. We'll see what happens. But when I showed his wife before the meeting, we went up early, that on 1978 I was talking about John Wheat Carr, who was the real son of Sam, that was helping with the murders and was linked to satanic cults. She said, well, how did you get that? It's just in the new book by Mr. Terry, The Ultimate Evil. I said, well, I have it at home in my files. Well, where did you get it? How did you know this? She says, we could be infiltrated. And she thought, her first feeling is that we were the enemy infiltrating the meeting, because I knew something that was out in 1978, by March 78, that is only coming out in a book in 1987. You can say you heard most of it always on World Watchers, years ahead of its time. She didn't believe how I would get it. I said, well, I would like you and your husband to come down, thinking that they'd be interested in the links of Himmler to the OSS, to Allen Dulles, to the Manson operations, and to Son of Sam, and Palo Alto murders, and San Francisco murders, and witchcraft. But she just looked dazed, like, I want to be the head of this, or I want that Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame, but don't tell me facts that confuse me. So whether or not we hear from them remains to be seen. I took some very other valuable material about Nazis in the San Francisco police departments. I really don't know if they comprehended what I understood. But I showed her that about John Wheat Carr, and did a broadcast in 1978, number 307, and we're up to 831 tonight, on Tex Watson, the Manson family, their Christian indoctrination, and some more on John Wheat Carr, how he was murdered at the Army base, and so forth. I was talking about these things a long time ago, and I have a list of past broadcasts. It goes on, and I have the research. A article just came out recently describing the new book, The Ultimate Evil. 10 years later, the son of Sam doubts persist. New book claims the cult was behind the slayings. And this Maury Terry, who wrote The Ultimate Evil, I have his phone number. I was in touch with him back in those days, 9 years ago. And a researcher in New York sent me a lot of material that was pouring out of the New York newspapers. And he just didn't understand what I was saying then. He understands it now. And he's making links of the cult of the Manson family and the North Dakota murders and the California church murders and the Long Island case of Roy Radin. I did a lot about Roy Radin, quite a bit. He was murdered in California. He was associated with the New York Police Department with Henry Kissinger, and he beat up a girl who was left to die on the subway. She survived. He was murdered in California about a year and a half ago. So the Ultimate Evil that I'll be sharing with you, and you'll all be able to get it, and I'm sure it'll be in paperback soon, is about these cases. Star newspaper, that sheet that's out at the liquor stores and on the newsstands every week, June 16th, has a long item about this book with David Berkowitz. It says in large black letters, 10 years ago, New York son of Sam killer David Berkowitz was caught and the case was stamped solved. But was it? Terrifying new evidence now shows that the son of Sam may not have been alone in insane murder, but a member of the nationwide satanic cult that still kills and gets away with it. You better believe they do. And goodness knows what they're doing to these little children who subliminally may be told later as adolescents to get into this knighthood or this killing. Children of the military will never know what was in their minds. In the book, The Control of Candy Jones, she told how she was injected in California, had to go all the way from New York City to California to be injected, where the psychologist would tell her to hate Jews, to hate blacks, hate the colored people and Italians because they all smelled. And this very nice young lady who was a model who had no antagonisms towards these people was given sodium pentothal by the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Department and told who to hate in the years to come. So the description of the book says the cults kill and get away with it. And not only do they kill, but the people from McMartin were telling about the ritual cutting. They cut goats, they cut their heads off and show the children. They mutilate the animals in front of them, and they kill real people. And I'll get the tape and put it on for you. You're pretty sophisticated to hear how they have breeders, women who are called breeders from this group. That's a new name they had in Nazi Germany, but that was to make for the Reich, to continue the strength of the Reich. The breeders of these cults, and these people know about this and had descriptions of these cases in California and around the country, are women who have babies so the babies can be cut up. And at one ritual, this person described, and imagine a whole afternoon of this, of after the baby is born and is just an infant, not too old, how they mutilate it, cut off the penis, put it in the mother's mouth, and cut the baby up to little pieces and want the mother to burn it. It's wrapped up, and she doesn't, so they do. That's a breeder for a sacrifice happening on army bases everywhere in this, a lot of places in this country and overseas. But I stress army because they're supposed to defend the United States, and this particular case brings out a man who's an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to the War College, who works with the Reserve, who had an honorary teaching experience in Washington, D.C., defense-related, who has 2 PhDs, a student of political science, an author of books on satanic witchcraft, taught at Golden Gate College, and is very influential, both academic, military, working with NATO and having rituals in the castle, the exact castle where Heinrich Himmler had the rituals, to teach his members, including Joint Chief of Staff of the United States, into those rituals. And the children at the Martin School saw other children killed and put into paper bags, and then they took hammers and smashed the bones. Can you imagine the sound and what these children went through? And most of the defendants were dropped, and they kept it with Mrs. McMartin, who's like 70 years old in a wheelchair, and they had to sit and suck her breasts. This is what we heard yesterday. It was horrendous, and it was the real world. It wasn't our dreams. It was our real world, and I'm glad I was there with Barbara to share it because she understood it, and to see and hear these people talk about these experiences. Now, the book, The Ultimate Evil, I'll be going into a lot of that with you. The man who was charged with those crimes was David Berkowitz, a postal worker. One of the things he described was that they had to give information of every member of their family, because then if they told parts of the story, their families would be killed. He said, why would he keep silent now? He said, upon joining the cult, and Berkowitz was adopted, born Jew, who in Vietnam, all these people have had this experience in the Vietnam War, and this Aquino, Michael Aquino, was in the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, and South Korea. Okay. It said that David Berkowitz, upon joining it, with other new members, had to supply photos and maps and addresses of his relatives. And they were told that if he left the cult and implicated other members, their families would be killed. Berkowitz has repeatedly admitted he fears for the life of his relatives. Now, do you remember at the heat of the Iran-Contra story how Betsy North leaves her home in Virginia to go to Philadelphia to the offices of Willard Zucker, The man who used to work for the Internal Revenue, who is the banker in Switzerland, who heads Lake Resources, and I'm going to do a lot more on Lake Resources and possible massacres, that Calaveras County massacre that took place where about 46 people were killed in Calaveras County, and only Mr. Charles Ng is sitting in a Toronto jail, and the police have covered up that entire bunker operation that could possibly link to the Iran-Contra people. And so remember when Betsy North went to Philadelphia, and Mr. Zucker said the purpose was to send money to a grandmother, a grandfather, a sister, a brother. Tell me who all your relatives are. Well, if these people are linked, if Ollie North knew this man in Vietnam, if this mind control session had anything to do with Ollie North, and it connects to Anton LaVey and to the witchcraft in San Francisco that is connected to these other operations, was she turning over all those names so that if either one of them talked, they would be wiped out? Is that why she went to Philadelphia? She didn't have to go see Willard Zucker leave home at the expense of probably involving her husband in looked like a payoff or whatever. She had no reason ever to see this man at all, or to turn over the names of any relatives at all, and children's ages and so forth. And because of the overlay of these people with the Satanic operations and the War College, NATO, the Joint Chiefs, was this what she was doing in Philadelphia? A very important matter to consider. Now, I will start, my time is almost up, so I will start next week and interject some of the articles in chronological order for you, starting October the 30th with the San Francisco Examiner, Satanic sect leader linked to the daycare probe. And this is about the San Francisco police investigating the Army Reserve officer who heads the Satanic cult, and that how the police raided the home, found all the things the child described. They took 36 videotapes, photographic negatives, photo albums, cassette tapes, photos of costumes, masks, and stars in connection with the investigation of sexual molestation and child pornography. This particular article that I outlined from the San Francisco Examiner said the search stems from a complaint of parents whose child attended the Presidio. Between September and October 1986, she was molested by a Mr. Gary and was taken to the Leavenworth house where she was filmed. Another man filmed her bathing in a tub. Right now, Michael Aquino is in St. Louis, Missouri. The search took place in San Francisco, and it goes on to say that Glenn Pamfiloff, P-A-M-F-I-L-O-F-F, Glenn Pamfiloff, juvenile division inspector for the Presidio, wrote Michael Aquino on August 28th and said he could not see how a Satanic sect could be involved, since he has worked very hard to be a decent, constructive, and responsible. This church has been a responsible organization. This is the one with the daggers of the Waffen-SS, and the prosecutor on the Presidio Army base says you are a very nice guy, and he sends a sympathetic letter that you are sincere, you're decent, you're constructive, you're responsible, you're one hell of a guy. So next week I'll go on with the prosecutor of the case, the FBI, and a Mr. Robinson doing absolutely nothing about the case, nothing at all. And if that isn't scary, that is your real world. That is not the world of dreams. This is the world of Ollie North, the War College, the Defense Department, of NATO exercises. It was during the 1982 exercises that Mr. Aquino was doing the rituals in the castle of Heinrich Himmler and illustrating to his people these necessary ceremonies for their knighthood. And members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are members of the Temple of Set. With that, we will take a 1-minute break and continue right after the top of the hour.